Good morning, good morning. We're going to start here in about 30 seconds. Good morning. For those that don't know me, I'm Steve, President and CEO, Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council, and we welcome you to this event today. And as always, we appreciate Texas Scottish Rite Hospital. They are very community-oriented, and they're very nice about letting us use their auditorium. So we certainly thank them for that as well. For those of you that don't know about the Hospital Council, we're comprised of 90 hospitals here in North Texas. And those hospitals compete, no question about it. They each want market share from the other. But when they come to the Hospital Council, we're Switzerland. That's where they deal with patient safety issues, they deal with workforce issues, they deal with things impacting the community and things that they can do to improve the health of North Texas. So we appreciate our hospital members. We also have members, associate members, and that's why we're delighted today that we have Mercer and also have Oliver Wyman that we work closely with. In fact, I met with Terry Stone in their office here this week, working on another conference that's coming up in November. And we have an excellent relationship with our associate members. We appreciate the work they do, and we thank them. And before I forget, next to you, you've got kind of a placemat. I think they're every other seat that kind of gives a nice summary and synopsis of some of the things related to Mercer and Oliver Wyman. And we also have extra copies out front if you need them. But we want to thank each of you for being here. What an important topic. You know, when you look at providers, especially hospitals, 50% of their operating expense relates to salaries, wages, benefits, all workforce related. So when you think in terms of workforce, the changing dynamics, for example, you can pick any of the hospitals in the Metroplex. The average age of nurses continues to increase. We have excellent nursing schools, but we still, as we look to the future, know not only nurses, allied health professionals, physicians, in Texas especially, we don't have enough residency slots. And we, every legislative session, strive to get more residency slots. We train a lot of physicians, many right here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But if they do their residency outside of Texas, most don't come back. Most physicians, 80 to 85%, set up permanent practices or permanent employment within 50 miles of where they do their residency. So it's very important. But you didn't come to hear me today. I'm just here to welcome you and thank you for being here. But we do appreciate the relationship we have with Oliver Wyman and with Mercer. And so this workforce topic is extremely important. We've got two experts that are here this morning. But I have the pleasure of introducing a person here locally that we work with, Bobby Dyke. And Bobby is a friend to the Hospital Council. He's been in the Metroplex a number of years, and he works for Mercer. But I'm going to introduce him, and he's going to tell you a little bit more about the program and introduce our speakers. So Bobby, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, and we so appreciate you guys being here. I know it takes time, and I know you're very, very busy, so we just appreciate you being here. Just a little bit about Mercer, and then I want to introduce these guys because they're right in a bit. And if, I feel lucky to have them here. One came from D.C. and one came from New York, and you know, it's incredible having a little bit of rain. I don't know about you, but I was in Oklahoma yesterday, and it was raining. And a lot of people were upset, and I wanted to step out of the car, and the angels are just running around. I was so excited, and nobody understood why. But they had some flight delays, and like I was telling, my phone buzzed at 12:05, and one of them had landed, and I said, "Woo!" and my wife didn't understand what was going on. So, but a little bit about Mercer. If you don't know, Mercer and Wyman, we help groups all sizes, all across the country and really all across the globe. But from a healthcare perspective, there's 462 hospitals, healthcare facilities, organizations that we work with today. It's a pretty big number when you think about it. And also in the Metroplex, there's a number and a couple that are in the room that we're working with today, either helping them with their talent, helping them with their benefit offerings and things to improve their ability to attract and retain the population, retirement, and so on. So there's a number of different ways that we support groups. And again, really the bottom line and what we love to do, and there's a number of Mercer and Wyman people that are here to be a resource for you. Caroline, Jeff, Mark Cronister, and they'll be around at the end. So if you have questions, we'd love to be able to just have a conversation with you. Our biggest thing is we just, whatever's ailing you, whatever's a concern or an issue for you, we'd love to be able to help you address that and to be able to help do it. So as I was going to introduce these guys, I've got 4 boys, 25 and 13, and a couple of years ago, my youngest, one of the special times if you've got kids is I was on a trip and came home, and when the kids run to you, it's kind of exciting when you walk in the door. And it was bedtime, and so Maverick is his name, and Mav wanted me to get into bed with him and kind of, talk about the day and so on. And he said, Dad, I got it all figured out. And I thought, oh, we're in trouble. And so he said, if I'm going to be a professional football player, I'm going to be like Tom Brady. And I thought, wow, that's pretty good. Tom Brady married to a supermodel, Super Bowl champion. That's not a bad deal. He said, if I'm going to be a professional basketball player, I'm going to be like Dirk Nowitzki. And I thought, wow, that's good too. Dirk's Dallas, NBA champion, and MVP. That's pretty good. And he said, but if I'm going to be a nobody, I want to be just like you. Wow, that's great. So the great thing is, you really have a Dirk and a Tom Brady here. They're not a nobody. And I just want to give you a little highlight on these guys. Chris Schrader is the senior principal based in our New York office. He's a member of our health services division, and he leads and works with organizations, really helping them identify issues within their healthcare, within their talent, within their workforce. What's great, at the beginning of November, Steve's actually going to moderate. There's an innovation summit that Wyman does. It's actually going to be in Dallas, and you need to kind of be looking at that. And if that's something you're able to attend, you really need to put that on the calendar. It's an amazing event that's actually in Dallas, and Chris will be part of that. The other is Matt Stevenson. Matt is based in our Washington, D.C. office, and he leads our workforce and analytic division. So one of the things you're going to be able to see in this presentation is what does the workforce look like? Again, I was just in Oklahoma City with a very large health organization yesterday, and they've got brand new 500-bed facilities going to be open in 2 years. And what's the one thing that they kept on saying? Where are we going to find the talent? Not just in Oklahoma City, but where are they going to have to go to get nurses, physicians, people to be in those and operate that 500-bed facility? They're already thinking about it, and of course they're a year and a half, 2 years off. And so I know that's something that all of you are having to address, and hopefully today you'll get some of that. So Matt, Chris, take it away.
Thank you all for being this morning, and Steve and Bobby, thank you for those introductions. We already did the introductions, but hi and hello. We're Chris and Matt, and I think we're excited for a good discussion today. We've got some topics we want to make sure that we talk about, and I think Steve referenced this little takeaway. It's got some of the key takeaways just as you sit here and reflect, and notes that you can kind of take with you, and there's a notes section on the back as well, so absolutely use that. But one other point, just Bobby mentioned the fact that we collaborate a lot in different ways. There's an initiative that we've put forward over the past probably 18 months around Workforce for the Future. And that's been a pretty close collaboration between Mercer and Wyman, whereby we're extending the lens with some of our healthcare expertise, the enterprise strategy work, the thinking and framing the future for healthcare, together with how we think about the workforce demands, everything together. And so that's, I think, why we team together really well in the discussion today, and we'll bring you kind of along that journey a little bit. As we get into it, I know we're kind of a big group in an audience here. Throw out a question if you have it. There's no kind of rules to wait till the end for sure. We'll try to address it and kind of move through, and if we table something, don't be offended. We want to make sure we get to kind of everything we're talking about.
And I do want to keep in mind just a couple points, which is we bring very different perspectives to how we work with health systems. And I want you to sort of take advantage of that and keep that in mind as we go through some of this material. Generally, Mercer typically works on the HR side, right? Working with HR professionals, working in some cases with chief nursing officers and those sorts of groups, and helping people find and retain and attract the workforce they're looking for. But one of the things that we're seeing is a fundamental change in how healthcare is delivered and how technology is impacting healthcare. And that, of course, has follow-on effects on the whole human capital equation. But that's where we see, the advantages that Chris brings.
Could you take up your volume a bit?
Sure.
Is it just me?
No, you're right.
Okay.
You're good.
I didn't want you to get, we don't want to waste this.
Hey, no problem. I got to say, I am most excited about this new lavalier that I got given today. Britney Spears, I'm impressed that, your daughter or your kid's actually excited to see you, but when I show them this, they'll be excited to see me. But yes, I'll speak louder. Thank you.
Yeah. And if you think about the title of the presentation and discussion today, it was challenging our thinking. And I think that's what we want to do today. We're going to approach that through a kind of pretty common framework, supply, demand, how we think about that. But if we think about challenging the thinking, I think what we want you to leave you with is, I didn't think about that quite this way. Some of the stuff may be a little further out, some of it may be near, but I didn't think about this quite this way. Maybe I should ask this question that I haven't thought about before that might help me think through some of these issues and start to get ahead of the curve. And the supply, demand, technology as a catalyst, we'll step through that, and I'm going to let Matt take us away.
Sure, and I'm going to start talking about just what we see in terms of supply in the healthcare workforce. And when I talk about that, I'm going to start with this scenario. And what we're showing here in this particular graph is a number of views around what the potential shortage of physicians will be in the future, right? And if we look at this sort of cone of uncertainty, as it were, we start with the starting point that says, we have this deficit. And then the folks who did this work ask these questions. How would this change if, for instance, we moved more work to, advanced practitioners? What would happen if we did this, if we did that? And the point of this is the future is very uncertain, obviously. But what we see time and time again is every organization is under a different set of assumptions and is actually addressing this differently. And really the takeaway that we've had from our work is that you are very much in control of your destiny if you so choose to do so. If you wait for the market to catch up to you, you will be at the low end of this distribution in your hospital. However, if you work proactively, you'll be at the top end, right? So these are choices that you can make that will impact the outcomes. And a lot of organizations don't realize that. They just sort of say, well, I'll just take what the market gives me and I'll try and pay a lot of money, right? And one of the things we want to say is because we see this fundamental change in the market, this then becomes very important, the choices that you make. So this is kind of the headline number that we see when we look at physicians. There's this big kind of uncertainty, as it were. When we look at other headline numbers, this is data that comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And every year they ask, what do we think 5, 10 years from now will be the difference in supply versus demand of key healthcare jobs? And when we look at these top ones, we notice, home health aides, nursing assistants, nurse practitioners. These are very big headline numbers. And these numbers are driven by a number of things. And we'll talk about what's driving this number of things, the very least of which is changing care models, right? The reason you have more home health folks is because more care is being delivered at home. The reason you have more nursing assistants is because people are trading out nurses for nursing assistants to drive down cost, right? The same with nurse practitioners. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But what our research has shown, however, is that when you look at these headline numbers, they can be very misleading. And the reason that they're misleading is every geography is actually very different. Right? We're working with one health system at the moment that cannot find nurse practitioners for love or money, right? And they're just bidding. And because the barriers to entry have gone down, it's very easy to find a job, and the barriers to exit have gone down, right? You no longer have a pension holding on to you or anything like that. There's a lot more movement. Whereas we're working with another system which has a 6-month waiting list of people who want to work there, right? Same state. Two very, very different situations. So understanding what is specific to you is very important as well. So what are these factors that are driving this supply-demand miss, right? And you folks live this every day, but we can kind of walk around this crew. The first is there's fewer people going into the profession compared to the size of the population. And this is leading to a shortage of clinical staff. Also, as organizations become much more digital, and we'll be hearing a lot about that in a minute, we see healthcare organizations having trouble adapting to the fact that they need IT staff that does more than just keep the email flowing, right? All of a sudden you're running apps, you're making sure that data flows in a different way than most folks are used to, and most physicians who are often leading the organizations know how to deal with. This, of course, is leading to physician dissatisfaction. We see a lot of people leaving the profession at the same time when they're needed, and the schools aren't expanding fast enough. This then leads to two follow-on effects, right? The first follow-on effect is all of a sudden a lot of these jobs have become technology jobs, even though they're classified as medical jobs. And we'll hear a little bit more about how that's being used. The second is as cost pressures become more and more prevalent, you see this move to what's called top of license. Anyone heard of that, the expression? What top of license means is we will take a particular profession, such as a nurse or a nurse practitioner, and we will make sure that they are doing only work which is at the very limit of their capabilities, at the top of their abilities, right? So no longer will nurses be doing things that potentially a nurse assistant could do. No longer will a physician be doing things that a physician assistant could do, right? What we're doing is we're substituting labor. And this is hard because what you're doing is you're changing a very, very long-term labor model within a hospital, right? Kind of building the plane while it's still flying. So we see a lot of organizations struggling with this. And this kind of speaks to what we heard before, right? The whole idea that you have this great demand for a lot of these professions, which previously had only been ancillary. Things like nurse assistant, nurse practitioner, and so forth. So this then is what's driving what's going on, the supply and demand. So what, right? Well, one of the things that we've found is that as these changes go on, it's led to changes in the quality of care. And we'll talk about that. And it used to be, well, quality of care was kind of neutral, right? If someone got sick or they got readmitted, you got to treat them longer. Now, when you have value-based reimbursement, if someone gets sicker, money gets taken away, right? 1/10 of all hospitals, this is not children's hospitals, but acute care hospitals and community hospitals, will get penalized this year for readmission rates and so forth that are too high. And one of the things that we have found time and time again is that how you staff your hospital has a very strong impact on these quality of care measures. And we'll get into a few questions around that. So in the past, you could build the plane while it was flying, but now if you do that, you actually incur not only patient cost, but financial cost. As a former patient, I know which one I care about the most, but the point being is that these things have become very prevalent now, where before they were considered ancillary. So what do you do about this, right? And this is where we're going to get into this whole idea of using data to answer many of these questions, using artificial intelligence. This is a slide that we put together with a few folks, including Intel, where we asked the question, what happens every minute on the internet? Well, this is now a couple years old, so it's probably completely wrong, but you can see thousands and thousands of different things that happen every second. And one of the things we found that when it comes to looking at data, especially around the clinical setting, is every organization is actually running a natural experiment, right? Every day when someone clocks in, we know how long they've worked in the organization. We know how much overtime they've worked. We know from your Epic or whatever other system it is, how they were treated, whether they got better or not, what the readmission rate was. And all that data can now be collected to ask this question, what predicts what? And this is the essence of what AI does, as a matter of fact. We're asking these questions. We don't know why, but we know what the associations are, one way or another. But what we see a lot of hospitals having trouble doing is moving from a pure research model, right, where we will do an experiment, to one where you're working with real-time data. And the analogy we hear is, the river never stops flowing. If you wait for the river to stop flowing, or if you come from Canada for the river to freeze, before you cross it, you will wait forever. So we have to get used to this final point, which is how do we make decisions with incomplete data that's always changing, right? And this is where a lot of these AI, machine learning, and also just experimental techniques come into play, right? If you've ever spoken to a doctor, this is what they do, right? Humans are constantly changing. You never have perfect information about the person you are treating. But when you're doing experimental work, you got to do something different. So what do we do? Well, let's ask a question about supply and demand. What we're looking at here is a visualization that comes out of an HR system. This is actually a nursing job family in a hospital. And how we read this is each of these rows represents a level of nurses in the organization. At the very top, we have chief nursing officer. At the very bottom, we have nursing assistant. The number of people represents the size of the bar. People coming in, arrows on the left. People leaving, arrows on the right. People getting promoted, arrows above. What we've done here is we've visualized, using data coming out of an HR system, your nursing population, or this organization's nursing population, as a system, right? And once we know the system, we can use it for a number of things. We can use the system to predict the future, right? Crank the handle, see what your organization will look like in a few years. Or we can use the system to examine the flows, right? In this organization, if you looked at their web page, people are our greatest asset, we will develop you, all the sort of stuff you see. But when you actually look at how the organization worked, what we notice is that at every level, they hire just about as many as they promote. Arrows coming in, arrows going up. So in a system where you get paid and you have status based upon promotions, they were actually taking away promotions by hiring lots of people from the outside. And this was driving turnover. Right? So this is one way of just visualizing data. But let's take this one step further. Right? Let's use this to ask the question, what does the organization look like? This is a hospital system we worked with, and here's where we get to this supply and demand. The top line on this particular graph is the demand for labor, in this case nursing labor, for a hospital system that was growing over time. Right? You see this gradual growth curve that has these bumps as they open new towers. The lines at the bottom are, using the systems model we looked at before, how many people they would have under various scenarios, high turnover, medium turnover, low turnover. And the takeaway from this hospital system was two things. One, obviously, even if we had no turnover, we're going to need more people. And one of the things we showed them is, well, in fact, those people don't exist, right? So you've actually got to lower the demand curve. You've got to find a way to do this with fewer people. And this is something Chris will talk about in a second. How do we lower this demand curve? The other issue is how do we keep the supply curve higher? And what is the right supply curve? So a follow-on to this was asking the question, well, how do I predict whether people stay? How do I predict quality of care? And here, one of the things we found is that you basically need a 3-factor model to predict these things. Right? And this is kind of the essence of these learning algorithms. There are 3 sets of factors in any hospital system which predict quality of care from the human capital side and retention. There are those things you can do nothing about, such as your location, external factors, which often determines the population you treat. Then there are factors about the individual, you and me. Then there are factors about the practices of the organization itself, how it rewards, how it hires, how it trains, all those different things. If you're missing any one of those 3, you will get an incorrect result. But all that data is available, right? All the data about the people, the practices, sits within your HR systems, your ancillary ICD-9, ICD-10 systems, your compensation systems. If you have the wherewithal to bring these together, you can ask and answer these questions. What we've found when we've gone back and looked at these studies where we've asked, what is it that predicts the difference between a high-performing department and a low-performing department? All right, this is in terms of HCAHPS, this is in terms of hospital-acquired infections, readmission rates, the standard panel. What we found is we can predict usually about 2/3 of the difference between good and bad. And those predictions are based upon only 2% is capital and technology factors, right? The type of equipment you have. 63% on average is accounted for things like whether you have a 12-hour or 8-hour shifts, whether you are working with a PRN model or whether you're working with a full-time RN model. All these different things, how you pay, how you compensate. The pullback from this is that you actually have control over a lot of these things, and this is built into the choices you make when you work with the supply side. I'm going to show a couple of examples of this and then hand over to Chris, who's going to talk a lot about how to change the demand. But we find this very important because this is kind of part of the essence of using data to answer questions. And it becomes very effective. There's also a little bit of a learning story about the dangers of AI in this particular case. So what we're looking at here is a health system that came to us and they said, we have these different models, we run 9 different hospitals. Can you tell us how our labor model influences our financial results and our quality of care? And so what we do is we take data from the systems, we create monthly panels, and we run something called longitudinal regression, which is fairly straightforward stuff. The software is almost free these days. And again, what we found is that the more RNs you have as a proportion of your total care population, physicians excluded, the better the results you have, which is fairly intuitive, but for an organization that was thinking to move to more of a nursing assistant model, that's kind of dangerous. The longer the employees have worked there, right, the better the results are. This is a very strong argument for retention. As you add incremental LPNs, this is good. As you add incremental agency nurses, this is bad. The last one is something we keep in here as an example of the dangers of using algorithms to understand what's going on. Right? We noticed that as the proportion of executives went up, patients got hurt. Right? And of course, as we presented this to an executive, it's like, how is it possible that when I hire another chief whatever officer, I'm hurting a patient? Right? And this is where it's important to take a step back from what these algorithms tell us. Usually the proportion of the number of executives remains stable, right? So what we were actually measuring was layoffs. When you had a higher proportion of executives, it wasn't because they'd hired a lot of executives, it's because they'd fired a lot of nurses. So what we showed them, as a matter of fact, that every time they had a layoff of some sort, the clinical and financial measures actually nosedived, right? Now this is, again, the danger of just reading these outputs and going, oh, the vice president of HR is killing people, but no. What was actually going on here was something different. So we keep this in kind of as one of these fun jokes, but the point being is that you can measure the impact of these actions. You can measure the risk, and there is more than just the simple financial side. Now, of course, when you are kind of constrained in terms of finances, one of the things you have to do is say, well, how can I do more with less without impacting these sorts of things? And this is something Chris will talk about in a second. This next one was the same organization came to us and said, we've noticed that the longer service we have of our organization, the better we do. So how can we stop turnover? Right? At any given time, we're asking this sort of question for 5 or 6 different hospital systems. And one of the things we find out is that generally every organization is a little bit different. But all the surveys came back saying, if you pay us more, we are more likely to stay. And that's generally what surveys say. The technology sucks and we need more money. But when we actually looked at people's behavior, this is drawing data from the HR systems, statistically comparing those people who stayed versus those who left, we found a number of very insightful things. And I'm going to point these out to you. Again, this is running an algorithm. So we don't know what the causal chain is. We just know that one predicts the other. So the first thing we noticed is that giving someone a $10,000 pay raise only reduced their likelihood of leaving by 3%. Marginal influence. These folks have been dumping money into the system for years and they'd kind of reached the limit. We did notice that there were some things that worked very well, such as their performance management system. If you notice, second from the top, if your needs improvement, much more likely to quit. If you're rating excellent, third from the bottom, much more likely to stay. Hey, this works. We're not going to change anything. But for us, the key insight was actually they'd hired someone who came in, and for cost purposes, they'd ripped out 2 layers of management. This was a hospital that hired a lot of people straight out of school. And one of the things we found is that people there actually really appreciated the supervisory structure. And we see this more and more often as we trail behind folks who've gone in and ripped out people for cost purposes. For this particular organization, the largest impact was actually the supervisory structure. If you were a supervisor, you were 56% less likely to leave. But for every 10 people your supervisor supervised, you were 48% more likely to go. All right, and this is a group with supervisory spans in the hundreds in some cases, very, very wide spans. So what did this organization do? Well, it took money from the salary budget and promoted more supervisors, right? Cost neutral, reduced turnover by 1/3. Have a great case study. CHRO very happy, CNO very happy. And this is how you can use these sorts of data and algorithmic pieces to work on your supply equation. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to talk a little bit about how you can work on the demand side and how technology is catching up. But I do want to leave you with this lesson that first, every organization, every system is different. So you have to know what is unique to you. And second, you can work with the data you have. It's been about a decade since we've run across a Wang system, right? And even then we were able to use it, though we had to go find the right book on how to get data from it. Yeah?
In terms of your data, did you, were these the performance, the satisfaction surveys that employees did through HR, or were there separate surveys? Or?
This was not a survey. This was taking data directly, in this case it was a PeopleSoft system, where we're pulling data directly from the underlying tables. So all of this is happening in the background. And what's important, and this is a really good question, right? Because surveys are great, but surveys will tell you only the things about the people who are here. They tell you nothing about the person who left last week. Here what we're doing is we're actually measuring behavior by taking data from your HR systems, PeopleSoft, Workday, still a lot of people on Lawson, those sorts of things, and statistically comparing, using an AI algorithm, those who stay versus those who leave.
So when you got the supervisor quit, and you looked at how long have they been there, their span of control,
Exactly. All simultaneously, which is the joy of the regression techniques. Any other questions before I cede the floor? Yeah.
I'm a little suspicious of the data, and I'm testing that right now. So I have a year's worth of data. What I've asked my leaders to do is, when they separate someone from the system, you choose from a list of separation codes. Enter that as usual. But I also need you to fill out a spreadsheet with additional commentary about what you know that you cannot input into the system. And we're going to try to figure out if there's a match. If the data supports what the conversation and the experience is providing. So I wonder if that's a factor in research.
Well, the joy of this sort of stuff is that you will always get a certain amount of unexplained variance, right? So you're not explaining everything, and that accounts for a certain amount of dirty data. The second is, if you've spent a lot of time with this, you know how to work with the data to what's called normalize it. So when we look at turnover, we only ask, were you fired or did you leave voluntarily, right? Because those two we're pretty sure whether you're one or the other. Everything else, the termination reasons, quite frankly, I give absolutely no credence to. The reason being there's something called social acceptability, right? If I left because you were sexually harassing me, I'm never going to say that. I'm going to say I went for more money or a shorter commute. So the psychological studies have found that generally exit interviews and termination reasons tend to have this social acceptability bias. They also don't tell you why you started looking in the first place, right? Generally the termination reason that gets into the system is why you chose this place versus that place. Well, they offered me more money. It doesn't say why you started looking. The whole purpose of this type of work is to do that. And you'll never explain everything, right? Our best models explain usually 80% of what's going on, right? Our worst models explain 5 or 6%, and then we don't charge money for them.
So is this one health system?
This is one health
And
system.
how do they compare? I'm sure you probably look at that with, whether it's regional or national and all that.
We've looked at hundreds of these, and we'll get different results on different towers right in the same place. And oftentimes what drives turnover is specific to the diagnostic type of work that's being done. The turnover in neuro-oncology and the ER will always be higher, simply because it's higher stress work. Right? So you've got to be able to account for that. And that again is where you start using the algorithmic terms, where you're just writing a line of code. What's the predictor for this group? Do we have enough data? And it'll tell you. Does that make sense? So with that,
And you use the data you have. The biggest level, which is, I think, a critical point as you look today, as you look in the future, as you just think about kind of almost every initiative you have, we're sitting on information that helps us make better decisions. What I want to do is look kind of a little bit more from the outside and think about some of those macro trends in healthcare that are going to impact how we think about the workforce going forward. That's more thinking about the size and shape and skills we need going forward, and they start to impact how you match up some of what we have today, what we know with where the future is going and what that looks like. And there's a number of different ways that this takes shape, right? One is one of the things we talk about all the time is the consumer in healthcare. There's varying degrees of how real we believe that is and how fast we move there. But I think that as a whole, we absolutely see a move from inside the office to more convenient settings of care. And when we look at that, it is convenience that drives that decision. As a consumer, I don't want to call and make an appointment. I don't want to go travel to the office if I don't have to. I need to think about, as I'm meeting that from a demand side, the consumer wants different things. They want you to meet them where you are. And that starts to look like a kind of a big macro trend as we evaluate where our workforce needs to meet consumers in the future. That can look like a lot of different things, right? We often talk about telehealth being a first step to that. We talk about retail clinics. We see them popping up in various locations kind of across our geographies, and that has a real impact, but it's more than that as well. It's embracing technology and meeting people, using that as a device to go and meet them. It's thinking about a portfolio of ways that we meet them and who we meet them with, such that we are meeting them where they are and where they need to be and that's what they are demanding and asking from us. If you think about the talent side and what that means, there's an obvious change in skills from a setting that we know today to go and meet someone somewhere else. It's just fundamentally a different way that we interact with people. The access looks very different, how consumers access us. That has a change on the number of FTEs we have. There's a down arrow here. There are scenarios you can imagine where it goes up in certain instances for certain populations, right? It's just a mix that we know is different. And I highlighted telehealth, engaging people virtually as one way that this meeting people outside of the office kind of matters. That's maybe the obvious one. I'm going to highlight this maybe with just one example. Mount Sinai in New York has a program they've implemented over the last 18 months where they essentially are intercepting people that come into their ED and evaluating them and saying, could this be someone I could move to the home? And I'm treating them basically in an at-home setting. They have the same level of care that they would in the hospital, and they're still kind of discharging and transferring them after like that 3-day period. They're still trying to do a lot of the same technology. They'll bring in more technology that will catch up. But as you talk to them and as they talk to their workforce about how this impacts them, it's the same people, largely the same activities and skills, they're just doing it somewhere else. And that they've expressed this as a challenge. despite the same things, I feel a little bit less comfort that I don't know what's in that next room. I can't immediately go over somewhere else. And that's a matter of I'm delivering the same things, but my workforce has a different set of needs, a different set of skills that they need to bring forward. And as we think about the impact they have on cost by doing this is kind of undeniable. There are going to be more models that shift and look like this and are things that we'll consider. The workforce is necessarily going to need to adapt to that and change to that as we bring some of those skills forward. That's kind of one big shift. Another big shift Matt alluded to, we've been talking about for a while, but is the shift to value-based care, new care models. In some sense, we're in operationalization of that. We're kind of stepping forward into that kind of slowly. We're starting with contracts that are different. We're thinking about transitions in care and managing that. But if we take that to its end, and what we believe as we design these new care models, things need to look like, the care that's actually delivered and how we engage looks pretty different. And this is kind of a mess of words up here. But if I think about the world I live in today, even if I'm a population health manager, I have value-based care models, most of my effort has gone into those transitions of care and making sure I catch people at times when they could pose a large cost. In the future, we're getting ahead of that. The teams look different. We start to think about how we engage patients and consumers different. We engage social workers as part of that. It's a collaborative team effort. And that just fundamentally is a different set of people that are engaging with each other and engaging with the patient. It requires a change from us, both in terms of what that staffing model looks like. It's a different leadership change that manages that. So it's not just the boots on the ground impacting things, but it's the person overseeing that, setting the direction for it. It's a different mindset for them. And skip that. There's a fundamental set of new roles that are involved in that, right? I've mentioned the social worker up there. If you think about the teams that are engaging and the people that are behind the scenes, we talk about kind of the data scientist that's looking and identifying who I should be engaging with. When I'm engaging with them, I have the social worker, I have the nutritionist, I have whomever else is part of that care team that looks very different in this world, right? And it's just not only the new people, but they're working together in a way which is more closely knit than it is today. So I'm seeing a big change in what that looks like if we push it to its extreme. And this will look different in different care models. We see it happening across in kind of spaces today. One example that we'll highlight is IORA. People in here familiar with IORA? Some people, basically, they've gone ahead and said, we're going to have a care model built around diabetes. It's a pretty obvious place for people to start, but we're going to redesign the care model. We're going to take on a capitated portion of risk for that, so we get paid for the whole patient, and because of that, we're going to just totally change the model and redo it. There's a whole bunch of things that they're doing, but kind of the two things to highlight is, one, they do have a team, and that team involves a whole different set of roles and skills. They do have social worker in there, they do have nutritionists in there, and when you talk to Rushika, their CEO, one thing he'll say is, I'm hiring differently. I'm hiring for people that engage with patients and consumers differently. I will much rather take the person that I meet just in a retail setting and is very engaging to me. I can teach them the other things, but I want that person who's going to be proactive and engage and live that role in a very different way. So it's engaging different roles, different types of people, but then in terms of how they work, there is no real quarterback. The kind of leader rotates on a day-to-day basis. And every day they're huddling and they're talking about it. We do that in some ways today, but in here it's those different roles conversing in different ways that allows them to kind of engage in this different care model. We see a couple different examples of this. I think this is kind of one evolution of where we can and need to go, but it has big impacts. If you think about this as a choice for how we go forward, if this direction is chosen, it's a different set of assumptions around what the workforce needs to look like. Another kind of macro trend driving healthcare and what we think the workforce might look like. New clinical technologies. So when we think about this, most of our minds go towards genomics and what we think about that. There's a fair bit of skepticism about how far we are in that, when we're going to get there. But ultimately, it's broader than that. Genomics is a big part of that. One other example that I can bring into play is behavioral science. Not just behavioral health and dealing with behavioral health issues, but behavioral science in terms of how to engage different people differently. Different people respond to different types of engagement. And that's a learned skill that we haven't really applied in healthcare except for kind of in our interactions and how we feel people out. And there's a whole science behind that, that as we get more information, more data about people, we can start to bring a whole set of new activities around how we engage them, and healthcare becomes much more personal. There's technology behind that. Our workforce, as we bring those technologies, is going to look, I think, different. We're getting closer to the point where it's very affordable to do genomics and testing, but I want to bring one example in to demonstrate, we can apply some of this today. Are people familiar with Newtopia? A couple? Newtopia is basically saying, I'm going to engage you as a person, as an individual, and I know that the same thing doesn't work for everybody, but I'm going to start to use genetics to do that and to deal with it, right? So what they do is they're addressing largely obesity and the comorbidities that can be associated with that. They're taking in a set of genetic tests and looking for markers that are going to divide people into 3 different buckets of what's going to work best for them. So whether it's diet, whether it's exercise, what type of diet that is, looks different based on your genetic makeup and your genetic code, and then they go ahead and apply that in how they engage people. Something that we're starting to do in healthcare, but something that requires a new understanding of technology, a new set of skills, and potentially kind of a new set of roles to go within that as we push genomics forward. Do we have the roles? Is there an epigenomic counselor of some sort where that role doesn't look like today? Do we even understand how genomics impacts how we think about the workforce? I don't think we have a workforce supply model that tells us that can catch up with that technology. And there's time to develop that and think about that, but it's something on the horizon that will impact the types of people that are engaging in the healthcare settings. One last kind of macro trend that I'll use to talk about the shifting workforce is kind of a need to be more dynamic, more agile. And this is, we think about all the pressures put on us by changing consumer expectations, managing continued cost pressures, a lot of which has spurned kind of some of these big announcements by companies coming in that we don't really know what they're going to do yet, but we know that they're going to try to take advantage and solve some of those challenges. And we need to be more dynamic in how we think about our solutions for that as a workforce, both clinically and on the business side, right? And what does that mean and look like? Like the traditional world, we plan, we budget, and we lay it out. We have a work plan that kind of waterfalls down all the steps. And we put this big investment out, and then over time we expect a return. It takes a long time, and it puts all the risk on the delivery at the end. The models that we need to challenge our workforce to think about in the future, quicker, right? They're different. They feel very different to operate in. They move, I love some of the words. We need to have a bias to act as opposed to a bias to plan. We need to put the risk smaller and upfront so that when we get further down, it is de-risked and can have an impact that is large, and we know really what's going to happen by the time we get to that big risk point, because we've tried it and we've iterated it and we've co-created it with our patients and with consumers, and it looks really kind of what they want, where they want, and when they need it. It feels kind of hard to think about that in a clinical setting where we're research-based a lot in terms of the new practices that we bring. Let me share kind of one example. So Penn Medicine, Roy Rosen's their Chief Innovation Officer, and 2 years ago spoke at the Health Innovation conference that Bobby mentioned. He shared an anecdote around what they were doing around challenges with the maternity population, particularly women who were at risk for miscarriages. And I said, well, this is a problem. We're not managing it well. We're spending a lot of money. It's costing us. And the experience is just terrible for everyone who's engaging with us. So how do we change that? They went and kind of embedded themselves with the patient population they were dealing with. And they said, well, we're going to create kind of a solution to engage them. It was a technology solution in the end. But I think the point here is they went through, and in 90 days of this initiative, they had 8 different consumer and patient-facing pilots that were rolled out, and they changed and they iterated on. And it wasn't just the back-end administrative processes. It was actually how the clinicians were engaging them on matters. They saved a lot of money, had a much better impact on these consumers, and it wasn't, plan, develop, build, launch. It was, I have an idea, let's make it work. At first, you know what? It's just an interface someone types something into. And I've got a real person on the back end that's connecting it, but it works and doesn't look that way to the consumer. And my next pilot, it's going to be a little different and expanding to their needs as I learn more. And eventually, as I pilot and build that, I'm kind of piloting into existence almost. I build and I launch it, and it improves and it goes on. I think broadly our workforce doesn't have the skill set or the permissions necessarily to do that and think about that in most settings today. So a whole new set of, this doesn't necessarily require a larger workforce, a smaller workforce. It's just a different way to engage and think about some of the problems as a workforce. So if those are some of the macro trends, some of the supply issues, we've been hinting at technology through this. I want to be a little bit more explicit about some of the impacts that we believe technology can have. And I want to do that through maybe a series of examples of companies who are starting to do that in the market today. I mean, kind of look up here, there's a broad set of buzzwords you'll hear about. Most of the companies doing this are engaging that. A lot of these words in some way or another. They're not all at different places in the evolution, and I'd say whereas a industry broadly, far away technologically from some of the promise of a lot of this. When we think about artificial intelligence, for example, a lot of our heads go to like Baymax and Hero, the movie, and kind of all the kind of, it actually seems like a human, right? And we're starting to do some of that with, you saw Google's natural language robocalls and some of the challenges around that. But fundamentally, the biggest shift as we apply technology is instead of taking data and rules and spitting out an answer, we are now taking data and observations or answers and learning rules for what works and applying them over time. And we're still at kind of, I would say, we have a ways to go before we're at the Baymax human level general intelligence, but we're starting to apply that across a number of different settings. But let's take a look at how we would apply this and what we think some of the impact of some of these technologies are. I think the first is, if we start to lean in and engage in technology, there's a real ability to expand the capacity that we have with our current workforce. And we can do this today, right? Has anybody used Augmetics, familiar with Augmetics? Anybody use scribes with the physicians, right? So what Augmetics does is it takes that and it basically, you wear Google Glass, the scribe is there, you're paired together, you learn each other, and that part of the technology starts to allow physicians, and Matt mentioned top of license before, you don't want your physician spending time scribing things. This is probably something we can all kind of say, yes, we're probably trying to address that in one way or another. Augmetics, put it on, scribe, physician spends time. People who implement this, hospital systems we've worked who've implemented with this, are actually seeing results. The physicians tend to say, you're not taking that away from me, it's great, I do what I want more. But some of them are even asking, if you do this, you got to see 10, 15% more patients. And that's real, and they're able to achieve that. It's as we've seen it happen, it's actually not that hard to do it if you can take away some of those administrative activities, expand the capacity. Another way, BrightMD, anybody familiar, use BrightMD today? Basic premise, telehealth, telemedicine with my doctors, but I'm taking away everything that you would have in terms of intake and triage. I'm providing that information to the physician right away so that they're coming in and they're doing it. You're probably reducing clinician time from the MD perspective, but you're certainly reducing all of that administrative upfront that would come in and take this by using the technology to automate that. There's some smart learning algorithms on that as well that'll choose that information and present it to physicians with recommendations and way you would use that. Then kind of enter the chatbots, right? Not the direct people interacting, but the technologies that are acting. We talk about kind of autonomous agents and things. There are a lot of risks and a lot of challenges with that we haven't sorted through, but I mean, have no doubt they are coming. The biggest challenge, our business models haven't caught up to that yet. Getting paid for all of these things as part of the care model, as part of the delivery. We haven't caught up there. We just haven't integrated this back into the doctor's office yet, but whether it's Ada, whether it's CareAngel, whether it's Giant, whether it's Conversa, there are probably dozens of these today, which will sort themselves out, but they're coming, and they're a way that we can do more with the current workforce we have by shifting some of that conversation. Another way, as we apply technology, reducing the administrative burden and cost of everything that we do. The real examples of how we can take cost out today. Just some of the examples already, the BrightMD is a prime example. They're basically saying, we're going to take some of the cost out for you from an administrative perspective as well, but there are other things that we can do today to apply that. We talked about scribing, augmetics. There's still a scribe in the background there. You're still paying for that. You're probably saving some money. Take that to the next level. Google is working with Stanford. They've actually already demonstrated a significant amount of time savings. Not just, most of the solutions we buy today that say voice, putting it into the ER, are still back-end physician clicking on a field, dictating. They don't have to write, they don't have to do anything, they can do it during the thing. Sometimes what Google and Stanford have done, they've applied the natural language processing technology to basically say the natural flow of the conversation with all the background noise. I have the technology to do and apply that can just feed directly to my EMR. All that time that I take charting, all that time that I spend dictating, why am I going to spend that? How is that going to change in the future? They haven't commercialized this yet, so that's the caveat. I can't go buy this today. I don't think we're too far off from a commercialized version of something like this. Another example, are you guys familiar with Forward? Basically, it's a different type of experience in the doctor's office. They've done a whole lot of different things, but it's this idea, if BrightMD was doing the intake and the triage remotely in a telehealth setting, so they're doing it in the live setting in the doctor's office. Said, okay, every time you come in, all of the vitals, all of the intake, you're doing it on a tablet. That's probably a really baby step. A lot of us may even be doing that today. So I don't have the paper transfer and I'm spending time on that and all the administrative costs associated with that. That I can do in a number of ways. Forward is basically saying, I'm doing that, and I'm applying that to the vitals intake and things as well. So all that's just, you don't see anyone until you see the MD. And some balances and some choices, that's going to work for some consumers, it's not going to work for others. But they're doing that at a different experience and a different price point. Olive is one of my favorites in terms of technology that I can apply today that can reduce the administrative burden. They view themselves as automating an employee's repetitive tasks. I can go in any prior auth I need to do, any eligibility checks, any follow-up on unadjudicated claims. I can basically show all of how I do that on my systems, and it will do that repeatedly on an automated basis as the human would do. If you work in Excel and you ever recorded a macro, it's kind of like that on the front end. Their website, this is, I think maybe my favorite part, is their website is hireolive.com. So it's like, oh, I'm hiring, they're a part of my workforce. They're doing what my workforce does, and that's how they're positioning themselves. And that, from a cost standpoint, you're looking at a trade-off of FTEs I may not be able to fill, or FTEs that cost a significant amount of money. It's a different way to look at that portion of the workforce. Other talent. We talked about supply and demand gaps. We need to think about sourcing technology as a way to source talent. We obviously have kind of different ways of sourcing on-demand talent today, so they're usually not very connected, and there's different ways that technology can help to enable us to do that. One example, Proxime, is the idea of, is kind of taking telemedicine to the specific clinical extreme of I can engage someone who's across the world who's an expert or has a skill set that I need and I don't have locally, and I can basically use someone to scrub in electronically. There are ways to do that which are just advice-oriented and having a conversation. There are now ways to do that someone is actually physically doing things as well from a remote location. Proxime does both of those and focuses on training as another method that they can do remotely with experts from all over the world. Another example, Stint. This is basically taking all of those sources of talent that are on demand, which I think is as a macro trend we are seeing more and more generally across industries, saying I'm going to make that available through a different service. There are a number of ways to do that. Stint plugs in geolocation in terms of how it connects people, different roles across the healthcare spectrum. They're probably still growing their base. I forget the total number of folks they have on there, but for the clients that they work with and the geographies they're with, I think their average fill time for a role when they post it is 15 minutes. When we think about our workforce going forward, and when we think about some of the demands that we have of new technologies, of some of the things that we talked about, one other way that the workforce is going to change and technology is going to catalyze that is augmenting our abilities. When we talk about AI, this is sometimes where our head goes. Well, it's going to do things in this new, cool way. And there are people doing that today that can help change the care models, can help think about what our talent does today and make sure that we have accuracy, we don't have misses, we can do things faster with the same workforce, do things faster with a reduced workforce. But just two examples. Google and Verily are working on a number of different applications, but their application around kind of a retinal scan of someone to detect cardiac events or potential risk for cardiac events. They've been very successful with the accuracy of this compared to humans, and have come in and basically said, well, we're going to apply this, and the person that does that can now be focused on treating. We're still in kind of the classification mode of this of I'm not recommending necessarily, but I'm identifying. And the clinician is still an integral part of working with that, but it changes what the role is that they do if we apply this. Another view, also in the cardiology field, is ultramics. Instead of looking in the cornea, they're looking at the echocardiograms and doing it digitally and basically improving on the performance of humans and looking at that, identifying more people who have different risk factors that they can then bring in and make sure we're treating and engaging in the appropriate way. Last bit I'll talk about on the technology side is we talked about the kind of need to work differently, work faster, work more iterative. Technology can help with that too. When I think about it broadly and when I talk about it with our clients, it's often about a culture shift, a conversation shift in how we work differently, which is people more than technology, right? But we need to have an underpinning of things that are there that allow us to do that. And more often than not, it gets back to the conversation Matt was having, full circle. What's the data we have on hand that allows us to make decisions quickly and move quickly? And so if I have data, if I have collaboration tools, there's a more empowered workforce to make decisions and move quickly. And there's a number of different companies. This is a small handful of the companies that can provide this, but whether it's from Tableau, who is doing data visualization so I can see things on a clinical side or a business side and make decisions more quickly, all the way to Slack, which is not healthcare specific, but can allow collaboration and is, I think, essentially winning that war for the office messaging system, or Nuna, who's more data science oriented but provides support in terms of moving software and applications very quickly. There's a whole host of things that just allow us to move quickly by providing information and technology that we can work on top of. So a set of ways that technology can impact us. Some of which I think are the examples I tried to pull are real companies today that are doing things, just because I don't want to push us too far out in how we think about applying it to impact. All of these have impacts on capacity, on cost, and our ability to deliver the right experience to our patients that is a change in how we think about the workforce. So let's there, and I think if Matt will join me, we can kind of maybe try to summarize what we think some of this means. The crystal ball portion of the, I would just like to, we have kind of complementary views of where the future goes and what it looks like, but the impact, I think, in both of our cases is that there is a need of actions and there is an impact that's real. At the very macro level, the crystal ball, we talk about it, we're going to see an increase in need for care, right? Our demographics tell us that. That's going to be a stress on the workforce. I think if there's, by 2030, there's like an 11% projected growth in population in the US, but 50% of that is seniors. Demand more care, require it. And so I think it wouldn't be unreasonable 25-30% increase in demand for care in today's current system. Then you think about, well, what does digitization do to my workforce? How does it go on top of that? There are choices we can make. I would say if I'm looking into my crystal ball, there's probably 40%-ish of roles that actually can be automated. We'll probably get almost halfway there over a longer time period. I don't know that we'll choose to automate all of those roles for a variety of different reasons. We'll look to an on-demand workforce more. That will bring that down. And with today's roles and views, that's still a big impact. If I'm sourcing talent a little bit differently, if I'm digitizing some of that, I can bring what that workforce size and shape down. It looks different and it looks smaller. Then I apply what changes. A 12-year time horizon is a significant amount of change possible. I would say it's not unreasonable to expect that the roles of half, maybe a little more than half of the workforce actually look pretty different than they do today. And the technology factors into that, the macro trends factor into that, and so thinking very far out, I guess I think I'm probably selling that a little bit short. I think it's a little closer than 12 years that a lot of these changes start to impact how we view our talent. And if we don't get ahead of that, we end up in this world where, Matt said, you're at the bottom of that curve, bottom of that chart.
And again, what we're saying is that at the very bottom line is organizations will have to do more with less. And traditionally, one of the ways, at least in the United States, how you do more with less is you actually substitute technology for people. But another point that we want to make is every organization will go through a different journey. And part of that different journey will be based upon where they're starting from, but also where they are. And that's why we wanted to show this particular graphic up here. One of the things we did is we actually went around to every state agency which actually collects expected supply and demand data for healthcare labor to ask the question, well, if we look across the country, how are things different state by state? And what we found is actually things are not only different state by state, they're different county by county in a very big way. And what we're displaying here is a view of the state of Texas, obviously. And how we interpret the graph on the right, which is the one I really want you to pay attention to, is the color of the geography, each is a county, part of the state, is the increase in demand. So the darker the color, the greater the increase in demand. The red dots represent the current supply of labor in that particular area. So the easy way to interpret this is if you have dark color, small dots, you're in trouble. If you have light color, big dots, you're doing okay. And this is a trend that we see quite clearly in large states, is that you have these concentrations in the city, but you have the highest acuity and the greatest increase in demand in the countryside. Right? So what you do is you've got, you look at the head count and you see, hey, Texas will have enough nurses going forward. But you miss the fact that they will be concentrated in the cities where most of the demand will be concentrated, not in the cities, at least the change in demand therefore. So this then poses a question to each organization, how will I respond to this? Will I throw labor at it? Will I throw technology at it? And you can either respond to that or you can try and get ahead of it. But what's important is understanding what your context is. Right? Again, we have those organizations that are dealing with turnover rates in their hospitals of 30 to 40%, which is horrific. Then you get others, which are in the same city, which are dealing with 2 or 3%. Because they've figured out their context, they have made the correct match between human capital and physical capital, in this case technology, and figured it out. But you have to figure out what is specific to you, right? The traditional response is that workforce planning, and this is a form of strategic workforce planning, starts out very broad, but ends up very, very narrow. So this, again, shows these supply and demands, and hey look, Texas, Houston, lots of red dots. Go a little bit further west, lots of dark blue small dots. So this is your 5-year warning, right? This is, actually, sorry, 7-year warning, 2025. On the left, of course, we're just showing a heat map across all skills, right? Those areas that are green, we expect the supply and demand to be kind of even. Where they get red, we expect it to be very, very difficult. And again, you see these patterns in the larger counties, which tend to be more rural, tend to be more red. All right, this is where the population is aging. Yes?
Is this effectively real time then, today, so to speak, in terms of what you have up here?
6 months ago.
Okay. Is there a projection of this?
This is actually the projection.
Oh, it is?
So this is what they believe 2025 is going to look like for the state of Texas. Now, of course, the old joke is that it's better to be roughly right than precisely wrong. And these are rough. But every organization, you don't have control over the sort of patients that will come in. You don't have control over what other hospital will show up down the street. But you do have control over what technology investments you make, and you do have control over who you hire and retain to a certain extent. And it's important to keep that in mind. There are some things you can't do anything about, but there are things that you can do things about. And rather than waste time on those that you can't, focus on those you can, make the correct investments, but most importantly, use data to inform them. Any other questions on this? So, back to that, use the data you have, right? We have yet to come across an organization that can't use the data they have to answer these questions, right? Hospital systems tend to be fairly good at this because a lot of it is mandated by law. Try doing this for an advertising agency. It's, forget about it, it's called chaos. Apply technology, optimize.
I think the applied technology is all about kind of leaning into the technology. You can take what we talked about today. There's no way an organization is going to apply all that at once. Pick a spot, try to have an impact, and kind of the same way we talked about iterating and keep doing. It's I'm leaning in to start, I'm assessing, and I'm growing in a way which makes sense for my organization, my patient population, et cetera.
And there is something called the second mover advantage, believe it or not. So when it comes to best practices for hiring and retention, those are quite difficult. But best practices around clinical technology, that's something that's fairly well established. And last but not least, invest in the talent supply. Now here I want to make a special point, right? The number of organizations we've come to that says, I'm not going to spend money on training or developing because basically the folks across the street are just going to take that money they would have spent and just hire them from me, right? The oil and gas companies have been doing that for generations, just stealing from each other. So how do you get out of that trap, right? How do you get out of the trap of, if I spend money on training and not on salary, they'll just get trained here and go somewhere else? Well, there it's figuring out what is specific to your organization that retains people, right? We have yet to work with 2 organizations that have exactly the same things that retain people. And these are across a broad category of factors. So when I talked about best practices about retention, understand what is the best practice of retention for your organization, not for the folks across the street. Because if you just copy them, you're probably copying something that doesn't even work for them either. So use data to understand that so that you can protect these investments.
Particular importance as you think about how organizations differ and the strategy going forward. There are going to be different areas of focus for each organization, especially as we think about how strong am I going to focus on engaging the consumer and looking at that. Am I moving to a more specialized model in certain ways? Am I embracing technology different than somebody else? The size and shape of the workforce of different organizations should look different based on the choices that they make, and your talent needs are going to be different. What community assets you lever to build that talent, what sorts of upskilling and training you need with that talent is going to look different, and all those factor into actually investing in that talent in some of the ways that Matt talked about.
So this is us, right? And there's free coffee, but we'd love to know if you guys have questions or if you want to come up and talk to us, or the questions you'd like to pose right now.
I have a question.
Yeah.
And this has to do with training and development, especially looking at bringing in individuals and doing some very specific training for the roles and the design within that system. So how important is it to have people with lots of experience in terms of the hiring process? Because you talked about organizations bringing in new people, and I'm a nurse, and I'm thinking about new graduates, not just new RNs, but new nurse practitioners or new nurse leaders. And so, are you looking for those, folks with 10 years of experience? And I'm sure there are going to be roles that maybe hit the ground running, and you want those individuals to. That's why you bring them in. But is there? What's your spin on that, or thoughts on that?
If I take it's going to be different depending on your purpose, right? And I know that's kind of the cop-out answer, but if you take IORA and the example I use, I'm hiring more for the soft skill and I can train the other skill. And it's kind of a matter of, given what you understand about your capacity and your needs, if you're hiring for someone that needs to hit the ground running, that's a different set of things. But the more that model shifts and the strategy is different, the more the more upskilling is going to be required. So that's not the best answer. It depends, but that.
Especially with the whole technology, and you've got folks that
Yep.
That's what they do. So you've got because of the whole concept of the scribing, how that working to the top of your license, and looking at what is it that you really bring that can't be automated. And I think it was Daniel Pink's work on the New World Brain, and he talked about the 4A's and anything that you can automate. And if you're in a profession that, let's say, an accountant maybe, and even an attorney where there's some things that can be automated. So what is it that's unique to your particular profession, but also to you as a person?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the more, you said, the soft or the qualitative side of that. I was just curious what you're seeing in these organizations you're working with, and again, their training, development, or
Well, I think from the studies we've done, I have yet to work with a healthcare organization where the length of service of the nursing population, especially the RN population, was not a positive predictor of quality of care. All right? However, the question is, how big is that effect? So, we don't know exactly what drives some organizations where the effect is huge, other organizations where the effect is comparatively minor. Our hypotheses are those places where the effect is huge as they have particularly acute care populations, right? The other hypothesis is the length of service value declines the more technology you put in, right? But there's not enough evidence to actually back that up yet. The tougher part, and I'll be quite frank, is people right out of school are looking for jobs. So it's easier to find those people, right? So you've got to take what the market gives you. What we found actually is there's some organizations which have basically changed their employee value proposition to attract a certain demographic profile of nurses. I'll give you one example of an organization which noted that the cost benefit of having a nurse who is kind of my age, late 40s, was well beyond that of the pay premium. However, it was very tough to attract those people to that hospital, right? So instead of advertising pay, they advertised quality of life, right? This was not a rural hospital, but a suburban hospital. And instead of saying, we'll pay the best, whatever, they said, you can work here and you can actually walk to work from your house because there are houses around here, the schools are good, that sort of thing. And in doing so, they were changing the way they went to market as opposed to saying, we'll pay off your loans, right? Which was actually turning off most of those folks who had paid off their loans 20 years ago. So again, it's what matters to you, right? If you're a downtown Manhattan hospital, finding folks who have 3 kids to work in that hospital, forget about it, right? It's just never going to happen unless you inherited an apartment or something. Suburban Houston Hospital, most definitely.
And also, I'm hearing, is the infrastructure within that system as well, because if I've got, some really great ancillary support systems, and even though I might have X number of patients, I know that I've got support for transportation, maybe for helping with, meals, and all of that. So again, it's more than just your patient ratio, it's the support. The nurses are really looking at that because you're working to the top of your license and you're doing things that, really are taking time, but it's not really value added in terms of what you're being hired to do and the skills and the competencies that you bring. So.
But the technical term we use for it is basically the demographic dividend, right? There is a learning curve, and it's a question of whether the price you pay for that learning curve offsets the quality you get.
Yeah, I have a question, Matt, on oral health, advanced primary care model. Is that like UCSF and Dr. Bodenheimer? Is that an iteration of that? Where is oral health? Is that somebody who comes in health hospitals or health systems? Can you flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, just a little more about it. Or there, I think there are a number of cities right now in geographies. They are not kind of they started as kind of a standalone where I'm going to take risk on someone for their diabetic care and the dollars associated with that, and I'm going to get paid in a capitated way. They're expanding that to other geographies and looking to do it. My belief would be they're probably still standalone, but looking for different partnerships. I'd need to look more specifically and connect some of that to know kind of what they're doing. But the advanced primary care essentially is what I'm talking about when I talk about that.
Oral health, are they a health system or are they consultants or who are they?
They're essentially a physician group, if you were to characterize them as that. They're not a whole health system. They have offices or a physician group. They have partnerships with different hospital systems. They're not a hospital system themselves.
And they accept the advanced primary care model?
When you say accept?
Well, I mean, you say a physician group. What are they committed to?
I'm not sure I'm understanding your question.
Well, UCSF has an advanced primary care model
Mm-hmm.
opinion. And there's, I stated a while ago, but I'm sure there are more advanced issues. But you say it's a physician group.
So
Is it in
specific,
geography?
they have a number of, so Seattle, DC, New York, there are a number of different places. They've tried to establish themselves in geographies and trying to grow over time. Is that, maybe we can take offline any separate questions.
Yeah, I'm from the University of Texas, I'm the faculty member at a workforce development program for healthcare at UT. And so my question is about the program we have right now is health informatics and health IT. And so in a non-clinical workforce, where do you see the skill set need being for the next few years?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the idea of applying technology and working differently to do that quickly, it's both applying the data that you have and making sure that works smoothly and integrated and can get in the right people's hands, and also having the agility to make moves and make changes for applications that people actually use. If people haven't shored up their data infrastructure and brought that up to par in a usable way, one for regulatory reasons, for reimbursement, et cetera, that's obviously a first priority. But then as we think about changing, moving forward, the biggest change is kind of the ability to make changes, frankly, move quickly, and that is, the technical terms that I think are probably thrown around too much, but the agile workforce, Scrum environments, different things like that are just different ways we work that if people haven't moved up there are, I think, necessary steps.
You see people working to embed a kind of an informaticist technician into clinical teams as part of the clinical team. So you talk about social workers and physicians and pharmacists. Do you see there being a need in a clinical team for an informatics focus?
Depending how you define the team, absolutely. There's a need for insights to allow them to engage people directly at the right time, and without information, you're kind of doing that by feel. The information provides you when, how, and the ability for teams to provide that information to the people that are engaging with the patients is real. Whether there's choices around whether you build that yourself, if you view that as kind of a point of differentiation for yourself, or whether you look to a vendor who might be able to accelerate that in a different way. Those are kind of strategic choices, but absolutely providing that to the team that's engaging, I think, is an important.
Decision support.
Yeah.
Using algorithms, and you can move quickly because you've got a structure in place that can,
And that would be the add I'd make to that. If you're looking to develop informatics skills for healthcare, being able to understand the predictive analytics, right? So you don't make the obvious errors that I showed in that particular screen, because you're dealing with people's lives in that respect. It's very easy to create a predictive model that is wrong, right? And so that requires a fair amount of statistical savvy, which the informatics folks we find don't have. They know how to move data, but they don't know how to use it to predict things accurately, and they don't know what the bounds of error are. When you're figuring out how many burgers to serve, if you're off by 10%, so what? When you're trying to create predictions of myocardial infarction based upon how quickly someone was triaged, that means a lot. So it's bringing that in. The second skill is also basically the hacking skill. You're working with 15 different systems, none of which talk to each other, being able to knit those data sets together. The expectation that the data will come out in a format that you can use, knit together, is wrong. So those are the two things that we see. I'm sorry, there's a question in the back.
Point us to any observational studies you might be aware of that tie together an actually functioning top of license organization to customer satisfaction improvements.
I can cite ones I've done. We haven't published them. The tough part, of course, is you're looking over a fairly short period of time, right? And we're not going to know exactly how this really works out until we've got a few more years of data, because everyone's in that transition right now.
Yeah, I've been asked for it, and that's why I posed the question.
Yeah.
I don't know of any, but if you had any, that'd be great. So we need another year or two of people actually functioning at top of license to be able to show some sort of statistically significant effect.
Yeah, to be honest, I can tell you it costs less, and that's about,
That's all.
that's all we got right now.
It just has a significant impact on flow and
Yeah.
the delivery of the services, so I'm wondering if customers like it better or worse when you adopt it, and that's one of the things
Well, let me give you one story that we learned from 3 healthcare systems. All right, this was an organization which was asking its nursing population to work top of license, and it had a significant proportion of male nurses. And when male nurses went in acting as top of license, they were either mistaken for doctors or for medical assistants, not nurses. So the feedback from the patients was, I am not being cared very well when there were more men on the floor.
That's a cultural bias, isn't it?
It was a cultural bias, but it was an identification bias,
Yeah.
right? The person wasn't coming in and saying, I am your nurse. They were just showing up, acting top of license, and were either being mistaken for someone who was really good, knows what they're doing, the doctor, though they didn't look right, or, you know, this guy should be changing my bedpan. So there is a lot of learning going on in that. And so that's one of these early indicators that we've seen. At first we thought it was an anomaly until we saw it in 3 different places. And the intervention is fairly straightforward. It's just make sure you identify, on the whiteboard it's written, my nurse is Joe, that kind of thing.
Is there another question?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm with the Group 1, the background screening company that's a subsidiary of the Hospital Council. We provide background screening for employment purposes and then post-employment compliance. My question is on the gig economy. That's a different sourcing model than we've seen before. Moving forward, who's going to be accountable for monitoring and for screening and for compliance purposes with this type of workforce? Because I do think it's very different from what we do now. And where do you see that evolving to? And will that include background screening companies like us, or are they going through a procurement model as opposed to employment?
You're seeing this wrestled with in other industries too, even with like the Ubers and Lyfts, there are real security and background concerns. Ultimately, if a consumer or patient is interacting with someone through your facility, you're going to be responsible for that, just full stop. That means there's choices about the partners that you use to source that talent and how you do it that you need to make sure you're aware of. So someone like Stint, I don't know the specifics of their credentialing and background checks, but that's going to be an important differentiator for those people that are sourcing that talent on the end that you are going to be accountable for if you're sourcing the talent from them.
And to build on that, as you see more care move to the home, I believe you'll see more of this gig economy. I have no evidence to back that up, but just the fact that you have now a dispersed number of people you're providing for. Originally they put everyone in the hospital so it was more efficient, right? Now everyone's all over the place. It's more efficient to have someone care them who lives close.
As you move to the home as well, and brand becomes more important as a trust factor, and you see in different geographies, different models of sourcing some of that talent come up. Pager, if people are familiar with Pager, basically just think of Uber for doctors for house calls. I start in Manhattan because of the density of population. I think they'll expand to other geographies over time. But if I'm engaging with them, I need to trust them a little bit in order to actually use that service, and that's going to be a differentiator for people.
And as you both will know, all it takes is one major follow-up with a patient and somebody getting sued to be able to come put some light on who's conducting the background screening, who's actually vetting that person before they step into that home and provide that service.
Mm-hmm.
So, just wondering, okay.
Is there one?
So there's a lot of talk about more with less as the population grows. So what are all those other people going to do? Does your data say anything about we've got lots and lots more people and we're trying to do more and more with technology and less people? So as far as that workforce shift happens, where do you see that in healthcare?
So when you're talking about the workforce, I would split it between kind of the clinical workforce and the non-clinical workforce. I don't think the clinical workforce is going to get any smaller, that's for sure. I just think the demand is going to increase. So what I see I think the clinical workforce is going to grow unless there's some huge correction to the Medicare market and there's just no money left, which may happen. It's happened in other countries. I think that's going to grow. It's just not going to grow as fast. And those folks are going to have to pull on new skills, right? So, you know, the classic one is I have this 88-year-old father who I've secretly given a Fitbit scale to. And he doesn't realize that if he doesn't check his weight every day, I call him to see if he got out of bed, right? I think that's a certain set of skills that that clinical workforce is going to have to adopt as part of making them more productive, right? And to be frank, we've seen this in manufacturing, we've seen it in all sorts of things over time, right? If you go to a manufacturing plant right now, it's a bunch of guys like me looking at machines that do everything automatically. Healthcare will never become like that, but there will be more of a shift towards using those people more efficiently, which is very different than just pedal harder, right? We're going to give you 20 patients instead of 10, figure it out. And that's, I think, where technology has to make up that gap, but it's still a question of how that's going to happen. But in no way do I see the clinical workforce getting smaller.
And I think too, you mentioned holistic. I think that from a provider perspective, it's not only what we do with our hands, but you know, it's connecting, you know, hard hands, and all of that. And, so that's gonna. I see there's a real being emotionally intelligent, being able to engage and influence and persuade. You know, how do you learn those skills, and how do you reinforce and train for that, and play all that stuff.
Well, I think you're completely right. As population health becomes more and more important, you see this very direct correlation between dysfunctional lifestyles and healthcare consumption, right? You know, if you can convince the person not to eat all the sugar, they might come back less.
Right, exactly.
And then that becomes, to your point, these more holistic skills, as opposed to just, well, we'll give them insulin.
Looks like we're about to be played off stage, but we'll be here.
Yeah, we certainly want to thank Chris and Matt and Bobby. Great presentation.
Thank you all.